violence every year. It's still waiting on a budget, and it's still sitting on the table. And that's not okay. The Violence Against Women Act should always be in place. There should never be any nail biting or whether or not there's going to be funding for these programs again the next year. And Trump quietly, this past April, rolled back the definition of what domestic violence is. It took us a very long time to move away from the judicial definition of domestic violence towards the much more comprehensive view of what domestic violence means, talking about emotional abuse and verbal abuse and so much more. It was a very long, comprehensive list of what that is, and it took years to get there. And as of April, it was rolled back to just one sentence. And so the Violence Against Women Act provides funding for Indigenous communities so that they can continue to educate and work with people, with victims of all sorts of crimes, sexual assault, rape, domestic violence. And it's a much needed act that is used to help keep our people safe.
I want to turn to Mark Charles. Mark Charles is the first Diné, the first Navajo presidential candidate in the United States. You participated in this forum along with a number of the majority of the Democratic or many of the Democratic presidential candidates. On what platform are you running? And talk about the significance of this Native American forum for you.
Well, thank you, Amy. It's great to be with you. And before I go any further, I'm here in Washington, D.C., and I just want to acknowledge that I am on the land of the Piscataway and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. These are the nations who lived here long before the District of Columbia, the state of Maryland, or the state of Virginia were created. And it's important to remember that these lands were not discovered.
And you were the first, you were the only presidential candidate to acknowledge the land where you were in Sioux City, if you can talk about that, in Iowa.
Well, yes. Wherever I travel, I work very hard to research and find out what Native nation, what tribes were living on these lands before they were colonized, and I do my best to acknowledge them and honor them wherever I go. Julian Castro also did a very good job of acknowledging the people of the land in his presentations. I was very impressed with how he conducted himself on stage. One of the things at the heart of my campaign, and as a nation, we really have a struggle with what George Erasmus would call common memory. When he was talking and writing a letter about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission up in Canada, he's from the Diné Nation up there, and he's a leader among the people. And he said where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community, he said, you have to start by creating common memory. I think that quote is genius, and it gets to the heart of our nation's problem with race, because as a country, the United States of America does not have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers a mythological history of discovery, expansion, opportunity, and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color and women and other marginalized communities that have the lived experience of stolen lands, broken treaties, slavery, Jim Crow laws, boarding schools, massacres, internment camps, mass incarceration, families separated at our borders, and there's no common memory. You know, people are acting like this crisis at the border right now is the first time we've seen this. But the United States of America has been very effective at separating children from their families throughout its entire existence. Whether it's through the slave trade or through the boarding schools or through the massacres, what President Trump is doing is not unique, it's not new. This is what our nation does. This is our history, and the fact that we don't have this common memory. And so many candidates and many Americans would like to believe that the United States of America struggles with issues like racism and sexism and white supremacy in spite of our foundations. In other words, there's this belief that we have these great foundations and we're just not living up to them. But the truth of the matter is, if you read our Declaration of Independence, which 30 lines after the statement all men are created equal calls natives merciless Indian savages, when we have a constitution that begins with we the people, and Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women, specifically excludes natives and counts Africans as 3/5 of a person, when we have a 13th Amendment that most people think abolishes slavery, but actually just redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. When we have these systemic foundational issues of racism, sexism, and white supremacy, we have to acknowledge the United States of America is racist, sexist, and white supremacist, not in spite of our foundations, but because of them. And these are the dialogues we need to have. These are the conversations we need to have. As I said at the forum, we don't need a new particular law protecting this vulnerable community or that vulnerable demographic. We need a new basis for our laws, which is where at the center of my platform, one of the key questions I'm asking is, let's build a nation where for the very first time, we the people truly means all the people. And to get there, I'm proposing that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation I would put on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. I would call ours Truth and Conciliation, though, because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony, which is not accurate. And I think we need one sooner rather than later, which is why this is one of the center planks of my platform, is we need to have this dialogue. We need to create this common memory. We need to acknowledge our past and ask the question, do we want to move forward? Do we really want to be a nation where we the people means all the people? And if we do, we have some foundational level changes that we need to make.
Mark Charles, Mark Trahant, and Christy Nobiss. We're going to be back with our discussion in a minute.